Builder! Blackmagic has finally broken their silence by giving us 2 pieces of news regarding the Pocket 4K. 1. Par for the course, the camera shipping is delayed and will not be shipped this month. 2. The camera seems to work pretty darn well up to ISO 3200. Done. Roll that intro. What's up everybody, you're watching Too Long Didn't Read Filmmaker, where the answers comes first, the reasons come last, but we are constantly and always still learning. So guys, the Blackmagic Pocket 4K is in the news again. Some good, some bad. Let's get the bad one out of the way. Par for the course. The camera shipping date is delayed. They're pushing it back to October, and that's not bad. Let's hope they're only pushing it once and they're not going to continue pushing it, because I think they are trying to get it out before the holidays. So let's hope for that. Now the good news is they've started releasing sample videos for us to see. Now, while the videos themselves don't actually excite me, because if you knew that that was the look you were going for in your mind before you shot it, then in theory, you can kind of light everything the way you need it to and get it into your Panasonic GH5s and A7Ss. It is gonna look a little bit different. I'm not gonna say it's gonna look exactly the same. However, if you didn't know what you were looking at and which camera was shot, it's probably gonna look good. So that being said, let's not look at the footage in terms of what they showed us, but what we need to do is look in the descriptions. If you start reading the little statements done by each videographer, as well as the equipment that they used with the Blackmagic Pocket 4K, we're gonna start seeing some very interesting clues that they were throwing at us on how this camera actually performs. So without further ado, let's do a deep dive on what they said. Now, while I don't know these videographers by name or their previous work, it's really hard for me to get into their heads to figure out what is it they were trying to do in terms of testing the camera. Well, one videographer, all 3 of his videos were straight up tests. That's all he wanted to do. He wanted to check for color, and he wanted to check for dynamic range and how much leniency he had in terms of post-production. The other 3 were more run and gun and out in the wild and basically documentary filmmaking. They just shot with the lenses they had, with the available light that they had. And these were the videos that I was most intrigued in, because they gave the most information visually, specifically the balloons one. The balloons one to me gave me the best idea of what I can expect from my usage as a narrative filmmaker, because he more or less shot at golden hour, and you can really see how the subjects are lit and how the shadow kind of wraps around their faces. And he even shot in very harsh conditions where he shot directly at the sun so that his subject was backlit. And these were the images that I was most interested in, to see what kind of image he was getting and probably how he was able to work with it in post. Now, beyond what they shot, the 2 awesome things was the videographers did tell us what lenses they used and what camera settings more or less they used. Now let's talk about the lenses real quick. They were using lenses that you and I used. The Sigma 18-35 was in there, the Rokinon Prime was in there, the Olympus Pro line of lenses was in there, specifically the 12-100 f4, and then the 17, the 25, and the 42.5mm f1.2. Those native Micro Four Thirds lenses were among the ones tested. We also had some Canon prime lenses in there, and yes, they did use the Metabones Speed Booster, not the Blackmagic Pocket one, the original one, but the Metabones Ultra. Those were being used, and we already knew that Metabones was going to work on the Blackmagic Pocket 4K. We don't know about the Viltrox yet. That has yet to be determined. Now, the second thing that they talked about was the camera settings, and this is where it gets interesting for me. Out of all of the 4 videographers showcased so far, the ISO range, the average was around 1000 to 2500. That was where a majority of them shot. There were 2 outliers. The outlier on the low end is ISO 800, and the outlier on the high end was 3200. But most of them hovered close to the second dual native ISO of 2500, which I think is awesome to know, because again, you take a look at the footage that they were showing, and if you really start thinking about how the shadows were wrapping from the brightest to the darkest, it was pretty darn smooth. Now, the big kicker out of all these 4 videographers, only one of them shot in RAW, and he only showed 1 video. It was the nature video, just no bugs, no balloons, just straight up waterfalls and moss and stuff. He was the only one that shot RAW, and in his description, it was because his shooting conditions are extremely harsh. He was kind of in this rainforesty area, so there were parts that I'm guessing is completely dark, and then you have this beam of light coming out and hitting a tree or a waterfall or what have you. So for him, he specifically shot in RAW. But the other ones all shot in ProRes, and then you start looking at the guy who shot the balloons. He was shooting straight at the sun, and I'm assuming he didn't really have any bounce or light modifiers. I think he literally just went up there with his camera in the hot air balloon and he shot. The amount of detail he was getting in those shooting conditions, and that he chose to shoot in RAW instead with his subjects completely backlit, this is what gives me the most idea of how I would use the camera, because he was still able to get such a great cinematic looking image in my eye. So you might not necessarily need to shoot RAW all the time, because all the other people just used ProRes, and they probably got it close, and then they were able to maneuver stuff in post. Now, that being said, the people that shot in ProRes, I'm going to assume that they shot in the log profile. I highly doubt that they shot at the standard Blackmagic picture profile and then just called it good, because I feel like if they did, Blackmagic would actually tell us that this is colors straight from the camera with a custom white balance, what have you. But no, I'm just gonna assume they shot in log. Okay, while all that stuff is the good hunky-dory news, I'm gonna play devil's advocate here. Yes, it's great that the camera is able to shoot RAW, ProRes, and it's able to operate up to ISO 3200 without breaking a sweat. What we don't know from these videographers is how user-friendly and how deployable was this camera on the field, because none of them talked about it except for one. One of them said that the back screen was very bright when he was outside, which is awesome, because the original Generation 1 Blackmagic production camera, forget it. Outdoors, you couldn't see anything. If the light hit the screen, you're done. You're not gonna see anything. Now, I'm going to assume that Blackmagic did not just send these videographers the camera and called it good. I think they sent them a very nice care package that allowed them to shoot without a problem. And that care package most likely includes a video assist monitor that Blackmagic makes. So if they do need to shoot some low angle stuff, specifically the guy that shot bugs, then he's gonna have a much easier time putting that camera down and calling it good. I'm also going to assume that they did not just give them a handful of Canon LP6 batteries so that they had to swap out every time, while they're shooting. I'm going to assume they gave them some kind of 12 volt pack that either hung on their shoulder or hung in their pockets or whatever, and then the camera could just go freely into the little XLR lock system. The biggest one here is I'm pretty sure that Blackmagic most likely gave them a nice handful of CFast 2.0 cards so that they didn't have to use a bunch of SSDs and have another cord coming out of the USB-C port. The reason I say this is because if you think about what I just said, their setup was literally camera, lens, and they were probably good with one cord for power. They probably did throw a couple Canon LP6 batteries in there, but I'm going to assume that they didn't. Because we saw, again, bugs, he was shooting at very low angles, so I'm assuming he used the Blackmagic Assist monitor. The person who shot balloons was on a gimbal, so most likely a Ronin. So I'm going to assume that at that point in time, he didn't want to have an SSD tied to it, so he probably had a CFast 2.0 card in there. So what's the bottom line here? The bottom line is, at the end of the day, This cinema style camera is an insane value at the price point, even fully kitted out towards a GH5 price point, because you are getting something that the GH5 cannot do. Obviously RAW is one of them, but ProRes and how well that ProRes actually works internally, and then the processing that they've done to pack it into that codec that allows you to get so much room for error in post. That is something that the GH5 simply can't do. If you really want to think about this, some people will say, well, I have an Atomos Shogun, so I can shoot ProRes as well. True, but your Atomos Shogun, when all kitted out, is basically the price of the body of the Blackmagic Pocket 4K. So if you kind of think about it, the Pocket 4K is basically a Atomos Shogun that has a lens on it so you can actually record. Now, based on everything that we know so far, mainly the ISO performance. The ISO performance is kind of what we needed to know in terms of the camera's actual performance. When it comes to wielding the camera, I'm pretty sure there's a couple companies now that are going to think about cage solutions so that you can have a nice good spot to put your SSD, and you can also have a nice good spot to put your battery. Once that is out, this camera is going to be insane. Now again, this camera is not meant for someone who doesn't understand what they're doing in post. When you buy this camera, you are thinking about post-production. That is considered into your workflow. When you're shooting with a GH5 and GH5S, you're able to get something that's more or less good, and you're only doing a little bit of adjustment in post. It's not a camera that's meant to be able to be pushed around. So if you take all this into consideration and you're getting into that type of production where you need this type of color fidelity and also room for error to make corrections and also to really get a nice, fine, smooth, crafted look, then the Blackmagic Pocket camera is hands down going to be an insane camera for this year, and it is something that I definitely want moving forward. It's not going to be something that I do for shooting events. It's not going to be something that I use for shooting stuff like this. It is specifically going to be used for either documentaries or my narrative films. So as we move forward in my career, I think my next feature film is probably going to deploy the Blackmagic Pocket 4K as my principal camera, especially when we're shooting outside. When we're shooting indoors, the Blackmagic is going to get the principal angles, and my GH5s are going to get additional angles that are not something that I'm going to be looking at for a very long time when I'm editing. Blackmagic, I think you've done it, and I'm really, really excited to see moving forward what you're going to do with all this technology towards your Ursa line. So keep it up. Hopefully you're not going to delay the camera any further, and I look forward to playing around with this camera eventually. And hey, that's it for this week, everybody. If you have any questions or comments, go ahead and leave it down below. I will get to them as fast as I can. And until then, like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.